how do you think of death, given all that we're talking about and sort of the first order, second order, third order implications of all of that? How do you think about death?
So physicalism has a very clear implication for death. If space-time is fundamental and elementary particles like electrons and quarks and protons and so forth are the fundamental nature of reality, and what your body is just an assemblage, a complex assemblage of particles. And your consciousness is somehow an emergent property of certain activities of those particles, so say brain activity. Then it's very, very clear that in death, when the brain dissolves, your consciousness dissolves, and that's the end of the story. That's the end. That's it. That's a very, very clear implication of physicalism. We can talk about panpsychism, but physicalism, strict physicalism, that's the end of the story. If consciousness is fundamental and space-time is just an interface, and our bodies are merely icons that we use to represent certain interactions of conscious agents, and we can go into how I think about that, then on that approach, there is the possibility that some aspect of my consciousness survives death. Now, there I have to look at the mathematics of the model and go into it, but it may be, for example, that the bare awareness that's associated with me, just awareness without content, that survives, but all the details of Donald Hoffman and his life story within this interface, maybe that all dissolves. Mm-hmm. Maybe we can, that's a story about what is consciousness up to. And we can talk about what is, if consciousness is fundamental, what is it doing and why? What is the dynamics of consciousness about? We really, to answer the question about death, we might have to answer that question too.
It's a big one. Please continue.
So I'll try a stab at that question because I think it relates to the death question. So what is consciousness doing and why? The right answer is I don't know. And I've only seen one idea that seems deep enough to at least be worth thinking about. And I'm not saying it's the right idea, but only one idea that seems deep enough to at least be a candidate. And it again comes from Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Gödel says that essentially, no matter how much you explore within a particular conceptual system, you can't get all the truth. There's always going to be more to explore mathematically. So if consciousness is the fundamental nature of reality, and consciousness is all there is, then mathematical structure is only about the possibilities of consciousness. That's all that there is to be about. And so what consciousness is doing, since the exploration of mathematical structure is in principle unending, then perhaps the exploration of the possibilities of consciousness itself is in principle unending. And therefore, consciousness, what it's up to is exploring all of its potentialities. And the reason it's continuing to do that, from our perspective, is because there's no end to it in principle. So consciousness itself is in some sense always learning about itself. And so perhaps then what we are, what people are, and what cats are, and what dogs are, and what amoebas are, and so forth, is consciousness trying on different headsets, different realities, and exploring and losing itself. I mean, so this is a very interesting idea that consciousness chooses to really explore so deeply that it loses itself in the exploration, doesn't even know what it is. It becomes a physicalist. It actually thinks that consciousness isn't fundamental. It goes through the whole bit and then slowly has to wake up. And in so doing, it really explores what it's not and what it is. In some sense, to know what you are, you have to know what you're not. And so So on that point of view, the Hoffman icon is simply consciousness taking a perspective on itself, looking at itself through a particular space-time headset, taking a little projection. And from that headset, there was a birth, there was growing strong until your 20s and 30s. And then after your 40s, you start declining, and in your 80s and 90s, you die. Mm-hmm. And that whole process is just consciousness exploring itself from a particular perspective, in which case maybe the Hoffman icon and maybe a lot of stuff can be left behind, but in some sense, consciousness itself has learned something through that experience, and the 8 billion other people and the quadrillions of amoebas and the who knows how many viruses and so forth. Consciousness is just trying on innumerable headsets, and when it's done with that headset, it takes it off. And awareness is perfectly fine. The raw awareness is fine, but the detailed icons that happen to appear, space-time icons, objects in space and time, brains, neurons, all those things, those were just icons, and you studied them, and then you realize pretty cool, really, Mount Everest, what a beautiful icon. Death Valley, what a beautiful icon. These are really, but I'm not that. I'm something even more transcendent than space and time. I'm more transcendent than Death Valley. And so consciousness is just waking up. I mean, I'm trying to tell a story. I'm not saying that it's correct, but it's the only story I've seen so far that at least is deep enough that is worth taking seriously.
Who is the origin of this story, and can you ever know that it's accurate, do you think, through testing or experimentation?
The story that I'm saying right now has an interesting way that you might be able to test it. So this dynamics of conscious agents that I mentioned as the Markovian dynamics.
Right.
You can make it so-called stationary dynamics in which the entropy of the dynamics doesn't change. But you can show that even if you have this Markovian dynamics of consciousness in which the entropy never changes, any projection by conditional probability, any projection looking at that dynamics will see it as increasing in entropy. In other words, the arrow of entropy, the arrow of time, is an artifact of the projection. So consciousness itself has no arrow of time, but you can prove from this mathematics that you get an arrow of time by projection. The proof is trivial, it's like 2 or 3 lines. So here's a project that I think would be really fun. Can we show that when you look at all the different ways that you could project consciousness in this mathematics, the conditions under which all these different arrows of time, the entropy that you get, satisfy the Lorentz transformations? In other words, can we get special relativity out of this? We would have to model also the space aspects of it, what's happening to space as projection of the dynamics of these conscious agents. But we see the time aspect. So could we actually show how special relativity arises as just different perspectives that consciousness can take on a fundamental dynamics of consciousness that has no arrow of time? That's the kind of thing where we could start to make brand new predictions that could be testable.